to approach the landowners are all over the board. They haven't talked to me for quite a while because the last time they approached me, I told them to talk to my lawyer, and they disappeared. They just went away. And but I know another individual that they will not let alone. That person lives by themselves on their farm, and and she's a little older than I am, and they perceive that individual as low-hanging fruit, easy to pick, easy to get them to sign an easement, intimidate it, get scared, get nervous, whatever, and they approach that person several times a week, either in person or with phone calls. And they won't let them alone. They just think, you have to sign, you have to do everything. At one point, they told the individual on a Wednesday, if you don't sign today, the construction equipment will be here on Friday and you will get paid nothing if you don't sign today. That was on a Wednesday, they had to Friday. Well, nothing happened, and they're just trying to intimidate her and scare that person. I told her, that person, you should document all these phone calls, all these visits, call the sheriff and say you're being harassed. One individual did that, and it stopped. They don't want to deal with that. I would hope that person will do this, but I talked to that person on 3 or 4 days ago. They said there's a new land agent in this area now. The other one either got reassigned or he quit out of frustration because they're making no headways. So the new person arrived, same story, same technique, smooth talker. We want to negotiate. We want to be your friend. We want to have good relations. Well, none of that happens. They'll look right at you and tell you a lie. They told this person that I had signed my easement and I'm ready to go. I haven't signed anything. I'm going to stand my ground. I'm not going to give in. But they try anything to intimidate people. And like I said, this person looked like low-hanging fruit. They get the weak ones first, then they can use that as a lever, say, hey, we got one more signed. Our percent of people signed has gone up. And what do we have here? Oh, they'll try anything. And they have financial offers out there. I got a letter in the mail, a registered letter. I knew what it was before I opened it. It was what they're willing to pay to get the easement. I looked at it, I thought, they got to be joking. You can't be serious. This other person I'm talking about got the same letter, the same offer. It's crossing about the same amount of area. So I just put my letter on a file and let it sit there, didn't do anything. And this person didn't do anything either. She got another offer in the mail, and she called me and said, I got another offer, what should I do? I said, would you mind showing it to me? And they doubled it. I got another offer in the mail. It was the same as the first offer. We're side by side. So those are the tactics they'll play. And but there's offers all over the board. I mean, they're not treating everybody the same. They're trying to do what they can get away with. And they think, if I give a little more money, maybe this guy will sign. This third guy, he might take a little more because he's standing his ground. And you don't know what's going to happen next. And these people will look right at you and tell you a lie when you know they're lying. I mean, then you catch them in a lie, then they try to weasel their way out of it, and they can't. And then they'll say, well, I have to leave. I'll go somewhere else. I mean, that's the tactics they use, and they're not very forthright people. And like one example, what they did, I put out 10 signs between Dyersville and Earlville. The signs said no CO2 pipelines, no eminent domain. They were professionally made signs. Well, one night they all disappeared. No, I don't think that was a bunch of kids running around stealing signs. They have their little spies out watching what's going on. So all the signs disappeared, and I never bothered to put new ones back out because it would just happen again. So they're out watching what people are doing, and they don't want people to know what they're doing. And to me, they just used underhanded tactics to try to get what they want. And you never know what they're going to do or what they're going to say. I don't feel they can be trusted because they say one thing and do another. So, but they are trying to intimidate people and strong arm them. If you don't sign, here's what's going to happen because everybody else has signed. I don't believe that for a minute and the numbers that they put out saying we have this percent of landowners signed easements. I don't believe that. They won't release names of the properties they're crossing so you can make your own map and figure this out yourself. They're real tight-lipped about that. They're in it for themselves. And they don't care about the people that own the ground or who they're crossing or the risk factors involved. I mean, there's so many unknowns on this whole pipeline system that it takes a long time to figure it out. And PHMSA, which is a federal agency that makes pipeline rules, they're in the process of doing that now. And for example, Summit Pipeline, which is in western northwest Iowa, goes up into the Dakotas, they were able to get their hearings bumped up to August because they want to get in ahead of PHMSA rules because PHMSA might put a moratorium on building any of these pipelines. And they think they'll be grandfathered in if they get ahead of the PHMSA rules. That's kind of a tactic that they're using right now. Navigator, the one around here, is they're further behind. They might not have a hearing for late spring next year. But the rules would apply to both pipelines and Wolf Pipeline, the one in Lynn County. So they're doing what they can get away with, and they don't care what they do to who, because all they want to do is get people to sign easements. And then, Paul, you got something?
What would happen if she put a no trespassing sign up?
Well, see, that can be a gray area. I think every county sheriff is handling that a little bit different. Some will say, yeah, put a sign up if you want, but we can't do anything about it. And the other sheriffs will say, yeah, if you got a no trespassing sign up, that carries a little bit of weight. I think every county is handling that a little bit different. You wouldn't think it would, but you think there'd be a blanket law over everything. But I don't think there is. Me personally, I do not have a no trespassing sign up. I've told surveyors to stay away, but that doesn't seem to work. They come and go as they please. Right now with the crops as big as they are, I haven't heard of any or seen any surveying other than the incident in South Dakota where they drove in the field and they started drilling test holes to see what was there. But you don't know what they're going to do. Every time you see a vehicle from Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, okay, these are pipeline people that'll drive around in the country. Because how many people do you know from Louisiana drive around Delaware County? I bet there's nobody in Delaware County with a Louisiana plate right now. Like I said, they're trying any tactic they can think of, and they'll get away with what they can, and they won't stop until you make them stop, whatever it takes to stop them. So they're out there, they're out looking around every day, they're doing something, trying to cover a little ground and get a few more people to sign. But I think it's harder and harder to get people to sign because people are starting to figure this thing out, and the money they offer isn't good enough. It's just, you got to be kidding. Yeah, that's kind of what it is. That's kind of like Trump change is what they offered to me. As you got to be joking. So
So I got another question for you, Larry. Do you know all the landowners in front of this pipeline in Delaware County?
do I know all of them? No. I maybe a third. A third would be the most. It's hard to. You can get a map, and you can look at it and start plotting the line across the county, but it's real easy to get lost because the maps aren't that good. And I told a person that there was a meeting in Manchester when they handed out some maps. I said, "Is this the best you can do for a map?" I said, "With the technology, with where they can print things and make maps, you could have a perfect map with all the section lines in it and everything where you could follow this pipeline from here to there." But I've never seen that map yet. And it's very hard to plot across the county and hit all the landowners because pretty soon you start to get lost. I mean, if you get off your mark a little bit on a map, all of a sudden you're going the wrong way and you're identifying a whole bunch of wrong people. That's hard to do. I've tried it, and I've gotten a little ways. All of a sudden, I know I'm in the wrong place. So,
Well, we're going to get started with our main speaker here. She was over in Monticello on July 8th, and I made a call to Jessica
Wiskus.
Mozar.
Missouri.
She was over at Manchester, and she couldn't come. There's something big happening in Des Moines today. She recommended Jessica Wiskus. She's from Lisbon. She's in our neighborhood. She's a professor at college. She knows what she's talking about, and she has researched this, and she's also in the line of a pipeline of some sort. Wolf, okay. It's all yours. Turn her on. We got her.
Okay. All right, is this working now? All right, thanks so much. And thanks, Larry, for speaking about this, because everything you say is true, and it resonates with our experience with the Wolf Pipeline. So I live in the southern part of Lynn County, Lisbon, rural Lisbon, and then my dad's farm is just a mile down the road, but he's in Cedar County, and he's also on the Wolf Pipeline. So this is really a family affair, but it's involved all of our neighbors. And one thing I did from the beginning is I got out the plat book and I took the maps, and you're right, they're lousy maps that they give. That's on purpose. They don't want us to be able to contact our neighbors, but I'm the 7th generation to live here. So I know the neighbors. So I got out the plat book and I just started plotting it, and that's how it happened for us on the Wolf Pipeline. So you'll learn a little bit more about later what we're doing to resist this, and we're just doing it together. It's literally me walking on a gravel road and a neighbor driving by and saying, "Hey, yeah, and we're talking. And that's how it's been, just door to door to door. And so I'm going to let you know a little bit tonight about some of the research that I've been doing and what I've been trying to learn about these, because the pipeline companies are saying a few things to us, right? And they're saying, "Oh yeah, these are really, really safe. Don't worry, we got you covered." And then they're saying, "Oh, this is really, really good for the environment. We have to have it. It's going to, save us from climate change." And then the third thing that they're saying is, "Oh, this is life or death for ethanol." Now, I don't believe any of those three arguments, and I'm going to show you why, because given what I've been learning, they're not presenting us with what it seems is the truth. So we'll get started here, and then there's lots of information here. If you have questions, please get in contact with Paul or get in contact with myself. I'm happy to send you the links to all of these. So there are 3 separate pipelines being proposed for the state of Iowa. So there's Summit Carbon Solutions, and that's going to capture CO2 and take it up to North Dakota. And then there's Navigator, CO2 Ventures, and that is saying that they're going to capture the CO2 and take it to Illinois. And then there's the Wolf Pipeline, which is likewise going to be headed toward Illinois. For almost 2 years now, my neighbors and I have been organizing to take a stand against the use of eminent domain for these pipelines. We've distributed yard signs, we've sent letters to the Iowa Utilities Board, we've organized parades, and that was Lisbon Sauerkraut days, and engaged with the media to raise public awareness. We've traveled to Des Moines, there's our famous red t-shirts, yeah, and contacted all of our Iowa legislators multiple times. And our little group has grown in numbers, and we are absolutely united as a community on this issue. So in fact, last spring, after a lot of phone calls and door knocking, I collected a list and I posted it on the docket of the Iowa Utilities Board, over 250 different families from Lynn and Cedar counties who've decided to say no to Wolf's offer of voluntary easements. 250 families signed this. To give you an idea of how this relates to the proposed route, according to Wolf, there are 97 centerline parcels of land set to go through Lynn County and 135 in Cedar County. So that's 232 parcels total, and we have 250 families, right? So, and keep in mind that some of the families on our list own multiple parcels of affected property. And so our list applies to over 300 individual parcels of land, both along the proposed centerline route and covering the entire pipeline corridor for good measure. So I have a map at home in the plat book, and I just filled in everybody who's saying no. So we are so strongly united as neighbors on this issue that in fact there is no way for Wolf to form a continuous route, even if they adjust the centerline. We mapped it out and we checked. So we're taking a strong stand here. And as I wrote in the Gazette on April 2nd, the entire affected community has rejected this project. So why are we so opposed to the CO2 pipelines? That's what I'm going to share with you today so that you get our side of the story, and that's the side that the corporations aren't telling you. And then you can weigh those two sides and make a decision about what you think about it. So for us, a principal concern is the threat of eminent domain. And be aware, it's not just the actuality of eminent domain, it's the threat of eminent domain that does the work, right? It's the threat that forces people to think that they have no choice but to sign this. So eminent domain is a power granted by the government to take away your property or the use of your own property against your will. Eminent domain as an extraordinary governmental power that takes away an individual's rights must only be used, quote, for public convenience and necessity. That's what the law says. So I want to show you a brief video here of a CO2 pipeline rupture. This was an experiment that was conducted by De Norska Veritas, which is a company out of Oslo, Norway, and they do research on CO2 pipelines to help actually the pipeline companies understand their own liability and their insurance requirements. So this is a very important company. We'll just watch a couple minutes of it. So they did a test of this. They wanted to see, well, what would it look like if this thing actually ruptured? So I just want to show this briefly and ask you to think in your own mind, does this look like public convenience and necessity?
This video shows a rupture of a buried, dense phase carbon dioxide pipeline. The experiment was conducted in a safe environment in the DNVGL, Spade Adam Testing and Research Centre, to assess the consequences of such ruptures in terms of mass outflow, crater formation and dense gas dispersion. The viewer should note that the extent of the visible plume does not necessarily represent the extent of the dense gas hazard.
Okay, I will talk more about this and the work that's been done, peer-reviewed research articles on this and other experiments, but I just want you to note, you can't see it very well on the screen here, I'm sorry, but that is a forest on the right side. So you have a sense of the scale of this. It's massive, and I'll talk a little bit more about what happened, what precisely happened here. So I will share the details of this in a moment, but first I want to go back to the PowerPoint and introduce you to the three main questions that I'm planning to explore today. So these questions have to do with the company's claims, right? So the first question here is, are these carbon pipeline projects safe for the public? Second, are they necessary for the good of the environment? Number three, are they necessary for the future of ethanol? So I ask these questions again. I'm not making up the questions. I'm asking these questions because this is what the companies are saying should give them the ability to trigger eminent domain. That's why these questions are so important. So here's the first one. Are these CO2 pipelines safe for rural Iowans in our communities? So I want to begin focusing on safety here. So many of us already live near gas or petroleum pipelines, and we don't give them a second thought. They're established infrastructure, and we willingly live with the minimal risks that they pose. But as it turns out, pipelines that transport supercritical CO2 are quite different from any other kind of pipeline that currently runs through Iowa. Iowa has 0 supercritical CO2 pipelines. So what is CO2? Is it the stuff in the atmosphere that we're breathing right now, a gas in its natural state? And no. So according to DNV, and that's that company out of Oslo again, this is the industry's leading risk management research company. The amount of CO2 in the air that we breathe is 0.04%, and this does no harm to us. But what will be transported via these pipelines is quite different. They call it pure CO2. It's 99.9% CO2. And it's transported in what scientists call a supercritical state. And this is a really fancy way of talking about a gas that's been put under so much pressure, so it's like 1,300 to 2,100 psi, that it's forced into a different state of matter. And this is the supercritical state. So this supercritical pressurized dense phase carbon dioxide is uniquely unstable and dangerous. So according to DNV's research, concentrations of 10 to 15% carbon dioxide can cause, quote, headache, increased heart rate, dizziness, rapid breathing, and unconsciousness in less than 1 minute. At higher concentrations, within 1 minute, it can cause unconsciousness, convulsions, coma, and death. So carbon dioxide is an asphyxiant. It displaces the oxygen in your lungs and results in catastrophic nerve damage. Only about 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines exist in the United States. And you could compare that to 2.6 million miles of total pipelines in our country. So this is very rare infrastructure, and it's not like other oil and gas pipelines. As it turns out, what travels through the pipe and under what pressure matters a lot. So a typical gas pipeline is under PSI of like 500 to 1,400, but the CO2 pipeline will be operating under conditions of 1,300 to 2,100 PSI. That's what Navigator says in their materials. So this extra high pressure means that a rupture will release CO2 at an explosive force. No, it doesn't catch on fire, but it does a lot of other things. So we know that carbon pipeline ruptures can and do happen. So PHMSA, this is the governmental body that reports on hazardous material pipelines. They've reported between the years of 2011 and 2021, so in a 10-year span, they reported 1 accident every 82 miles. And though almost all of these accidents took place on private company land, that's why we haven't heard about them, almost all of these pipelines are built within special pipeline corridors, or they're point-to-point services that the company owns the land itself. So even though we haven't heard a lot about these dangers, we do have some idea of what they look like because of the testing that DNV did. So the video that you watched a moment ago was one such demonstration. So I want to just talk this through a little bit and talk about what you're seeing here. So this is from a peer-reviewed scientific article published in July 2021, Risks and Safety of CO2 Transport via Pipeline. So I will compare what they found in the research with Navigator's CO2 pipeline project. So in their experiment, they looked at the rupture of a pipeline that was approximately 8.6 inches in diameter. Navigator says they'll be between 6 and 24 inches. This pipe was buried underground, and it was under pressure and temperature parameters equivalent to Navigator's pipeline projects. So I laid it out there. The results they report is that 136 ton of CO2 was released in 204 seconds. That's a little under 4 minutes. And the visible plume, which is what you saw in the video, caused by the CO2 went up approximately 197 feet, and horizontally across the ground approximately 1,312 feet. That's a quarter of a mile. So the question is, what is this visible plume? It's a solid form of CO2. So basically it's like dry ice. And in the section that DNV has put out on design and operation of carbon dioxide pipelines from September 2021, this is what they had to say about this. They say inhalation of air containing solid CO2 particles within a release cloud is particularly hazardous, since this could result in cryogenic burns in the respiratory tract. So imagine you're breathing in dry ice, as well as additional toxicological impact due to sublimation in the lungs. So representatives from both Wolf and Navigator have admitted at their public informational meetings that by default, the minimum setback, the distance between your house and the pipe, the minimal setback for habitable structures is 25 feet. What about PHMSA? That's the Federal Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. So their job, as it turns out, is to regulate what goes on in the pipe itself within that 50-foot right-of-way. And that's where you get that 25-foot, distance, because they only have a jurisdiction over the right-of-way, which is 50 feet. The pipeline's in the middle, so you can be 26 feet from that. And PHMSA they can't do anything, right? So PHMSA has no regulatory authority over the siting of the pipelines. In other words, where they are built, how far from your house. However, states that have experience with carbon pipelines, and that would be like Oklahoma, Texas, Wyoming, they've recognized this safety loophole. And according to this article, citing carbon dioxide pipelines, they've passed their own legislation to regulate the siting of these pipelines. For example, setting a minimum distance from a school. But we have no such protections in Iowa because we have no experience with CO2 pipelines. So as a result, when Navigator was coming through my section near my neighborhood, this route put farmhouses, ball fields, churches, historic buildings, Native American burial mounds, and even school districts in the pipeline corridor. And to be within their pipeline corridor is to be within a quarter of a mile of the source of the supercritical CO2. So if you look at Wolf's proposed route, it's within feet of property owned by one of the largest school districts in our area. This is College Community School District. There's 5,000 kids. It's one of those school districts where they put all the kids on one campus. That's it. That's their campus there. The pink is the pipeline, right? So how could we save the lives of these children if there were a pipeline rupture? There isn't enough time, nor enough emergency personnel to get them out. But what is a safe distance? This is an article from Jody Freet, who is the EMS director over in Cedar County. She's been great. She's been standing up and speaking out and trying to engage the media, trying to get the word out there about what's happening and the burden it's going to place on all of our volunteers and our EMS services. So the question is, what is a safe distance? If only we knew, right? But DNV, the world's leading authority on recommended practice for the design and operation of CO2 pipelines, does not, in their entire report, they never specify a safe distance. That's because even they do not know what a safe distance would be. No one knows, because it depends on so many factors, not just the diameter of the pipe, not just the pressure under which the CO2 is traveling, or the distance between safety valves, but also the local topography. CO2 is heavier than air. It will move down. It will settle into valleys. It also depends on the soil composition, the ambient temperature, the wind speed. and other highly variable factors. So in the end, DNV says it's not really about distance, it's about concentration and time. So they do put this in their report, this graph, and I'll just talk through what it means. So the red line is SLOT, the red line is SLOD, significant likelihood of death. All right, the blue line is SLOT, specified level of toxicity, dangerous toxic load, meaning you're going to have significant damage if you are exposed to CO2 at that level. Now, if you look at this graph, down here on the bottom, 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, that's the amount of minutes of exposure. And then here, along the vertical axis, is the concentration of CO2 in the air. So for example, if there's a concentration of 10% CO2 in the air, you know, within 2 minutes, you're going to start having these terrible effects on your health. But if the concentration, if you see, of CO2 is 15%, in less than 1 minute, you're on the red line there. So how long do you have to escape? As it turns out, you know, any vehicle, any emergency vehicle with an internal combustion engine needs oxygen in order to operate. And they shut down, right? So how are you going to pull people out, right? So at the public informational meetings with Wolf and the IUB last August, a year ago, Wolf's engineer, Patrick Brierly, said, and I taped him, yes. He said, quote, "The industry doesn't have a standard." And then he said, "The results aren't in on the dispersion modeling. The dispersion modeling is the prediction of how far this thing would go, you know, if it ruptures." So the question is, why is this being done so irresponsibly? You have to understand that of the tiny percentage of pipelines that transport CO2 in the US, almost all of them so far are point-to-point systems, not networks, like Summit, Navigator, and Wolf are proposing. And most of them go through land already owned by the pipeline corporation itself or through a designated pipeline corridor, as in Wyoming. So there are no houses, there are no schools, there are no, you know, farmland actually being farmed in these places. I recently got documentation on the CO2 pipeline in North Dakota. There's one that heads up to Canada. And the safety files there show that there are no habitable structures within 760 feet of that pipeline. But that's not how the routes have been designed in Iowa. In Iowa, there are homes and school property within tens of feet. So recall that the day scientists conducted the test demonstration here, the visible plume of CO2 traveled 1/4 mile in under 4 minutes. And that's just the solid form of CO2. What's important and what you might have heard in the video is that the gas travels even further. So if you notice, the camera was watching, and then at a certain point in time, the camera started swinging wildly back and forth. That's when the gas hit the camera. The gas is invisible. It's odorless. You can't see it. Nevertheless, it's still deadly. So we learned that thanks to a real-life accident. We also know that the gas form travels much farther. So this is Satarsha, Mississippi, and a CO2 pipeline near this little town ruptured on a Saturday night, February 2020. In the evening. So this was a 24-inch pipe, and it released tens of thousands of barrels of CO2 in the 8 minutes before the pipeline was shut down. So yes, they do have automatic controls, et cetera, but they didn't actually get the darn thing shut down until 8 minutes, and so all of this was spewing out in the meantime. So that's many times the volume of what you saw in the demonstration video that we watched. This is a photo after the rupture. Now what you notice is there is not a speck of life left here. You know, it's Mississippi in February, there should be grass. This happened in a deeply wooded area. This is what it looks like. Yet, because the rupture happened in a densely wooded area 1 mile from the town center, luckily it was a mile away. There were no houses in between. Because of that, you know, and because the town had a very tiny population, the census said there were 38 people in that town. I think of it like Sutliff. I'm from near Sutliff, and anyway, it's like Sutliff. Come down to Sutliff, have a tenderloin. Anyway, because it was so small and it was so far away, emergency responders who were absolutely heroic were able to evacuate those people, and there were no deaths, only people sent to the hospital. Still, this is the local paper afterwards, and the emergency responders describe what they found. And they said they found some people choking, some unconscious, some in a seizure, and others foaming at the mouth. In this case, the distance of 1 mile was the difference between hospitalization and death, because the distance, of course, determined the concentration of CO2 in the air. That's over 5,000 feet. But in Iowa, it will be tens of feet from us. Recently, PHMSA announced that it must, quote, strengthen its safety oversight of carbon dioxide pipelines around the country to protect communities from dangerous pipeline failures. And this is a move they're making as a result of the investigation they did following Satartia. But here's the new rulemaking. They issued a calendar for when they're going to come up with these rules. It's scheduled to be October of 2024, right? And we know that Summit's hearing is starting on August 22nd of this year. Now, of course, it's scheduled that way because they actually are, they created grants, and they're giving them to independent scientists, not to industry, but to academic scientists to study this, to come up with some kind of modeling, to do a better job than what perhaps industry itself, which has other motivations, is able to do. So, of course, it does take time to get this kind of stuff done. I mean, they can't come up with it right away. So there is a window of time, 2024, when they think that the science will be, kind of clear on this, and we could take some guidance. But of course, my question is, why are the CO2 pipelines being built in Iowa before the necessary safety studies have been completed? And it seems to me that such willful risk-taking cannot be a public good. All right. That was the longest one, I promise. Second one, are they a necessary good for the environment? Because that's the case they're making, right? So you've probably heard of carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS for short. And the carbon is actually carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. And so the reason that they want to capture this is to sequester it, to bury it underground. And in Iowa, we are being told that that would reduce the carbon footprint of ethanol and help address concerns about climate change. But as it turns out, there's more to this story. So, liquid CO2, or supercritical CO2, which is what we're talking about in these projects, is actually a commodity. It's worth something. It's sold and bought, as the oil and gas industry will tell you. And that's because it's used as a tool for more oil and gas extraction. So you've probably heard of fracking, but this is similar to fracking. So they take the CO2, they sequester it. Yes, they do bury it underground, they do. But they use that to push up more oil that's stranded in oil fields. And so this is something that has actually been used by the oil industry on their own land for decades, mainly down in Texas and Louisiana, but also now in places like Wyoming, Colorado, North Dakota. And so how much oil do they manage to pull out? So a lot. For example, at a facility called Petronova, which is down south, the Journal of Petroleum Technology reported that their increased oil production was 1,300%. That's a lot. So as you could see down in this slide, this source is from 2013, and down here, this is from actually from the oil industry itself, from ARA. They say the single largest constraint to increased use of CO2 EOR is the lack of available, affordable CO2 supplies. What they really want is affordable CO2. It was shortly after 2013 that somebody hit on the idea of ethanol. This isn't driven by ethanol at all, and I'll show you more about this later. But what is important to note is that according to this article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, this process adds more CO2 to the atmosphere than it actually takes out. And this article from Biophysical Economics and Sustainability confirms that, and they find that fossil fuel interests have moved to reframe an old oil extraction technique as a new climate mitigation method, but it is net CO2 additive. CO2 emissions exceed removals. This is really important because all we keep hearing about in the media is that, oh, this is green, this is green, this is green, right? That's why they say it's a public good. As it turns out, over 90% of supercritical CO2 in the world is used for enhanced oil recovery. And including this, which was the Alberta carbon trunk line that was built by Wolf and operated by Wolf, which has proposed the third carbon pipeline in Iowa. None of this is necessary for the environment, obviously. Do we know for certain that's how it will be used? We don't know for certain, but in an interview with Minnesota Public Radio back in 2021, Bruce Rastetter, the head of Summit, admitted that his economic model for the pipelines wouldn't be viable without federal tax dollars for enhanced oil recovery. So yes, the 45Q tax credits that they want to claim can be used also for enhanced oil recovery. None of these pipelines would be possible without the massive amounts of federal tax money that will be funneled to these companies through the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's rather telling to look at this map. This is part of a study that was conducted under the auspices of Princeton University, but it was funded by ExxonMobil and BP. It was funded by the oil and gas industry. And so in this map, if you could see, you could see Iowa here. The green there are sources. I'm not sure we could see it here on the screen. Anyway, those are the sources of CO2. Things like ethanol and fertilizer facilities in the Midwest. And you could see that the proposal here is to build this infrastructure all across the country and take them to these gray shaded areas. And those gray shaded areas show location of oil fields where enhanced oil recovery could be used. So you'll notice that it goes up to North Dakota and it goes down to Illinois, just like our CO2 pipelines. Here's a version of the map that Wolf gave, and this is what Larry was talking about. The maps are terrible, right? But this is a version of the map that Wolf gave to the Scott County Board of Supervisors meeting last spring, and it follows a route very similar to that previous map. And so the question is, does Iowa know about this? I mean, do the companies in Iowa know about this national plan by Princeton? Well, here's a slide from a PowerPoint presentation. It's by Scott McDonald, who was the Biofuels Development Director at ADM. And this slide is housed at the Department of Energy website. So the presentation as a whole contains research as recent as 2020. So I think it's a pretty current source of information. And here it shows the Illinois basin potential. It describes the millions of barrels of oil that will be recoverable by injecting supercritical CO2 into the ground of depleted oil fields in Illinois. Indeed, there have been multiple studies by the oil and gas industry about the, quote, stranded oil prize that waits underground in Illinois. They have a lot of depleted oil fields in southern Illinois. That's where this is headed. However, there's no oil prize for Iowa, right? On the contrary, we will have our ground ripped up, our lives put on the line, and our tax dollars wasted. So that leads me to a third question, though. What about ethanol? So, is eminent domain necessary because it's good for ethanol? So this is the last section of my presentation. But first, I want to take a brief step back to the issue of property rights in the Constitution, because the gorilla in the room is eminent domain, right? Private property can be condemned only if justified by public convenience and necessity. So what is public convenience and necessity? Actually, according to the Iowa Supreme Court in 2019, economic development is not enough to constitute public use. You can't take away one person's private property and give the gains to another person. That is not constitutional. So in other words, the fact that one group of people, in this case pipeline executives and lobbyists, can make a lot of money from a project does not justify taking away someone else's constitutional rights. In fact, in this ruling, the Iowa Supreme Court was so outraged by this notion that they became like sarcastic, and it's really rare to hear a Supreme Court, writing something sarcastic. But here's what they say. They said if economic development alone were a valid public use, then instead of building a pipeline, you could constitutionally condemn Iowa farmland to build a palatial mansion, which could be defended as a valid public use so long as 3,100 workers were needed to build it and employed 12 servants and accounted for $27 million in property taxes. So they're being sarcastic, right? They're saying this cannot happen in Iowa. This is not right. So I think everybody in this room knows that, right? This is the issue. But perhaps you heard from others last winter, others who feel that their personal paychecks may be tied to these pipeline projects. Perhaps you heard that carbon capture and sequestration will be, quote, life or death for ethanol. Some even derided and insulted the broad coalition of farmers, legislators, and citizens who oppose eminent domain. Indeed, 78% of Iowans oppose the use of eminent domain for the carbon pipelines. But according to some industry lobbyists, it's in our best interest to relinquish our constitutional rights and embrace the corporate takeover of private agricultural land. Well, these gentlemen recently had been called to task for their claims because the CO2 pipelines are private projects that will benefit international pipeline investors, not Iowans. So Wolf, for example, their investors is the Canadian pension plan. So this will benefit Canadians. It won't benefit us. Last winter, a bill was introduced in the Iowa House that would have required a 90% threshold before of voluntary easements before eminent domain could be triggered. And regarding the cries of lobbyists who at the time said this is life or death for ethanol, Representative Bobby Kaufman said, the notion that this piece of legislation is going to kill the ethanol industry, there's a lot of four-letter words I could use to describe that, and I will not do that. So I'll just simply call it BS. So why is it BS? Because you have to read the fine print. The ethanol industry doesn't need to condemn our land. In fact, the building out of the CO2 pipelines could prevent the ethanol industry from claiming the benefits of the 45Z tax credits. So I want to zero in on this because it's so important and nobody's talking about it. So first of all, in the report that motivated industry lobbyists to claim life or death for ethanol, there's a rather startling disclaimer by Decision Innovation Solutions, the company that prepared this report. In the preface, they say, we make no representation as to the accuracy or completeness of the data and factors used, or in the interpretation of such data and factors included in the project. And then they say, well, the project does include certain estimates and possible explanations for ethanol plant operating margins and the impacts of tax credit changes on ethanol plant operating margins. It cannot be ascertained with certainty the extent to which these estimates are entirely accurate. It's a funny way to start your report, right? To say that you disavow everything that you're writing in the report. It should be no surprise to us that they left out something very important. So I want to look at what happens and trace this. So last winter, on February 14th, Decision Innovation Solutions released their report for the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association, and there was a flurry of media hype. And the report was being used to argue for the necessity of the carbon pipelines so that they can get eminent domain. Interestingly enough, a little over a week later, Wolf Carbon Solutions filed their affidavit for petition with the Iowa Utilities Board, and in their application, they refused to ask for eminent domain. Do you see they crossed it out? They're flaunting it, right? They could have just left it out, but they crossed it out. So 1 week you have industry executives saying, we have to have this, it's necessary, we must have eminent domain or we're all going to go under. And then Wolf files right after that without requesting eminent domain. As you know, Wolf takes its directives from ADM, whose Cedar Rapids facility is Iowa's single highest ethanol producer. So let's be frank, if anyone in Iowa understands the future of ethanol, I really think it's ADM. And ADM did not request the power of eminent domain. That's because ADM read the Inflation Reduction Act very closely. If you claim the 45Q credits for the pipeline for sequestration, you are ineligible for 45Z, which is for clean fuel production. And I am not assuming that ADM knows this. This is a letter from ADM to the federal government, to the Internal Revenue Service regarding this. regarding Notice 2022-58, request for comments on credits for clean hydrogen and clean fuel production. They know that you can't double dip. The 45Q and the 45Z is an either or. It's not an and or both. And so the law was specifically written to prevent double dipping, and ADM knows that. So not only are the carbon pipelines not necessary for the future of ethanol, they would actually prevent the industry from qualifying for 45Z. So this is the law. Any facility that claims the 45Q credits from carbon capture and sequestration is ineligible for the 45Z credits. So let's look at this. The 45Z credits are only available to a qualified facility. You could see that. You know, government, they put these words in that they have a lot of meaning. So what is a qualified facility? Here it is. The term qualified facility, I'll send this to you later, does not include any facility for which one of the following credits is allowed under Section 38 for the taxable year. And number 3 under there is anybody who took credit for the carbon oxide sequestration under Section 45Q. Carbon oxide is a scientific technical term for carbon dioxide. In other words, if you claim 45Q credits, you cannot claim 45Z. Decision Innovation Solutions left that out of their report, a report that they themselves disavow, as I already pointed out. But the biggest ethanol companies in the state already knew this and set their sights on a different path forward. So it all makes sense if you look at their actions over the past couple of years. So in February 2022, there was a bill in the House that would have created a 100% threshold. It would have ended eminent domain for the CO2 pipelines. And neither POET nor ADM registered in opposition to that bill. So if they weren't opposed to the bill, that means they don't need eminent domain. Second of all, POET's sustainability report lists several different pathways for achieving a net zero carbon intensity score, and so does ADM's carbon reduction feasibility study from March of 2020. So actually in this report from ADM, and you can find this report and download it for yourself, carbon sequestration is not just one of many different options for ethanol. It's actually the worst of these options. So they made a ranking of the most impactful reduction options, and this is ranked in order. Last comes on-site carbon sequestration. It comes in dead last. And that's because of something that gets a little technical, but I think it's super important. The carbon that the technology can capture right now is only biogenic carbon. Biogenic is the stuff that it means life, right? It's the stuff that comes from plants. So you know when a corn stalk is growing, it's sucking up carbon dioxide and it's using that to grow. And it actually sequesters it in a way, right? We know that the living plants are doing this. So that plant itself is sequestering the CO2 just naturally, you know? And then when the corn then ferments, and anybody who has a corn bin and has smelled this before, you smell it, right? It releases that carbon dioxide. That's a totally natural process. It's part of the carbon process of life. So it's referred to as biogenic CO2, and it's considered totally carbon neutral. Considered, I mean, by people like the EPA and people like the EIA, the Energy Information Administration. They don't even count biogenic CO2 when they're counting CO2. They don't count it because it's carbon neutral. Guess what? That's the only thing that they can capture from the ethanol plants is the carbon neutral stuff that nobody's even counting. It's interesting. So this biogenic CO2 is, as it turns out, a very small portion of ethanol's carbon footprint anyway. So this is, again, from ADM's own report. 70% of their CO2 emissions comes from coal. It's not corn. Corn is not the problem here. Coal, right? So they saw this, they know this, and their own report says what's the best thing that they can do? The single best thing they can do is renewable energy and biofuels. They could switch away from coal. That's what they can do. And then that will help them qualify for those 45Z credits. So they can, increase other efficiencies around their facility. And POET, again, has another plan for actually stopping to produce more carbon dioxide in the first place rather than capturing it and transporting it. So here's the other thing I want to show you. ADM is actually the only ethanol company in the state of Iowa, of which I am aware, that has actually experienced carbon capture sequestration. So they did it at their facility in Decatur, Illinois. I don't know if you can read this. They got some big grant from the government to study this, to say, okay, how can we capture this stuff? Let's just try it, and we'll sequester it on site. They could do that in Decatur. And so this project, which it didn't require a pipeline, I mean, really not much of a pipeline, it was right on site where they sequester it. It was funded by the federal government again. And so from November of 2011 to 2014, they did capture carbon dioxide. And the question is, did they lower their greenhouse gas emissions? No, they did not. So this is data. You can go on the EPA and you can track all this. So this is ADM in Decatur, Illinois. And if you look over here at the top, total facility emissions in metric tons of CO2, 4.4 million. That was in 2010, before they started capturing. 2011, they started capturing the CO2. Look at their total emissions. It went up. And in fact, every year that they were capturing it, it goes up. And the highest it goes is the last year that they captured it, 2014, 4.7 million metric tons. Then when they stopped capturing it, the next year, 2015, it actually went down. So they were using that practice of capturing the carbon and then dehydrating it and pressurizing it and sequestering it underground, and all of that actually generated more CO2, than when they weren't doing it, which is crazy, right? Now, here's something. How does that happen? How does that mathematics work? If you look in this, there's AR4 GWPs. Those are standards that the world uses to help calculate CO2. It says excluding biogenic CO2. Do you see that out there? Excluding biogenic CO2. In fact, everything that the EPA counts excludes biogenic CO2. So if you're going to capture that stuff, and the only stuff you can capture is from the fermentation of the corn, which is the biogenic CO2, it's not even being captured here. And it costs a great deal of energy to do that process, and that's why the number goes up. So if they say they're doing this because they want to be green, or they say they're doing this because, the government is pressuring us and blah, 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 yeah, just look at the data. Right, so anyway, biogenic CO2, the CO2 produced by corn, actually is not counted at all in calculating that greenhouse gas footprint. It is considered carbon neutral. It's only anthropogenic CO2. That's the CO2 generated by burning fossil fuels. That's the only thing that is counted in all of this. So in the end, capturing the CO2 from corn fermentation, as all of the CO2 pipelines in Iowa are designed to do, will not make an iota of difference in ethanol's attempt to lower their carbon footprint. And I think that's really important to know, because increasing their emissions will make it impossible for them to qualify for 45Z tax credits, even if they should find some way around the prohibition of the double dipping on the 45Q. And so, the 45Z credits are based on actually reducing the numbers that the EPA are counting there. And if you're capturing it and your numbers go up, this isn't going to help you out on that, right? So in conclusion, I would say that what is at stake is the violation of our constitutional rights by the unnecessary and therefore wrongful triggering of eminent domain. So on all the counts that they give of the reasons why they should be given the power to condemn our land, all three of them don't hold any water. So hundreds of Iowans, including me, have been trying to stop the use of eminent domain for private projects like this, because the threat of eminent domain has a host of consequences for every rural landowner. As it turns out, this is what it looked like when the Dakota Access Pipeline came through Iowa. So there was a farmer who went through it and captured these, and you can see what happened here. There's evidence of the mixing of soils and compaction, working of the land under extremely wet conditions, damage to the tiling, and much more. And by the way, I mean, many people in our neighborhood have been talking with a regular tiler, and there's no tiler who's going to want to touch this ground after there's a CO2 pipeline in it. They can't insure for that kind of a risk. And so there are many people, just from personal experience, they're right next door to me, and all their tiles are going like this, and the pipeline goes through. It's going to snap all of them, and there's no one who will come in and repair that tile. All of this has direct financial consequences for rural families, of course. And I want to close with one last thought. Oh, this is 2 years later, 2 years after that Dakota pipeline was put in. You can see it. So I want to close with one last thought. Maybe you think that this is an issue about my backyard or Larry's backyard, that this issue just boils down to money. After all, everybody knows that a farmer's wealth is in the land, right? But my experience in the last few months in listening to my neighbors has shown me how this issue cuts to the very core of our values. So private corporations want to take the part of the wealth that's seen on a property deed, but they disregard what the land really means, and they disregard the part that is the true gift. So land for many of us means something much more than just a line on a balance sheet. And many of us come from families who have lived here and farmed here for generations, and I'm the 7th generation in my family to live on good Iowa soil. Let there be no doubt that historically private property rights are the only way that freedom and liberty, including the freedom to practice one's faith, can be kept secure. Look, for example, at what happened to Ireland in the late 17th century when they were a British colony, after the penal laws took away the rights of Catholics to own land. When government takes away land ownership, they take away the power of individual citizens to live in freedom, to worship in freedom, to govern in freedom, and even to survive as a culture. Our nation may have started out as a British colony, but the Declaration of Independence set forth radical new ideas about what the relationship between a government and its citizens ought to be, and that relationship is grounded in a fundamental right to property. We've been fighting these pipelines not just because we are affected, it's about more than just us. It's about all those who lived and loved the land before us and those who will come after us. So it's about our heritage, and it's about our hope. Land for us is about the abundance of life that's rooted in the earth and that fundamentally is not of our own making. We live our lives in relationship to something that's greater than ourselves, and that is the true gift that the land has given us. And it's because of this that so many of us will not sign voluntary easements with these pipeline companies, no matter the dollar amount. So thanks very much for listening. I know there's a lot of data in there, but
You mentioned 45Q and 45Z. It means nothing to me.
okay. So thanks for that question. I appreciate it. So these are the tax credits. They've been around for decades, actually, but with the Inflation Reduction Act, they just got bumped up significantly. So now it's something like $85 per metric ton. Now it's more than twice what it was before. The federal government will give these pipeline companies tax credits, and in fact, they made it even better. They'll just pay you for this, for capturing the CO2, transporting it, and sequestering it. So that really changed the game. You know, it just opened the floodgates, so to speak. This is why you see everybody scrambling to get these things now.
What's the difference between G and Z?
Oh, thank you. So 45Q,
Q and Z.
45Q is in the Inflation Reduction Act. It is what you get for capturing CO2 and transporting it and sequestering it down in Illinois or North Dakota. That's the money you get for that. 45Z is something totally different. It's the clean fuel production credit. There, ethanol companies, including ADM, that's why they posted about it, ethanol companies can get this tax credit. And what is it for? It's for reducing your greenhouse gas, that number that the EPA was showing. So in other words, you know, they're going to be getting money if they just lower that footprint. That's why ADM has a report saying, how do we do this? Let's, you know, stop using all this coal, and then we can lower our footprint, and we'll get, you know, reimbursed or paid by the government for this. So 45Z is worth a lot directly to the ethanol companies themselves. 45Q is for those pipeline companies. They get the 45Q. And then they're saying, oh, well, we're going to share it with the ethanol companies so, you know, everybody gets a little bit of the love. But you can't, because you can't double dip. So the law was written, and that's what's so crazy about that report that was put out by Iowa Renewable Fuels. They left that out. So when you read it, the impression that you get is that, oh, they could get 45Q and 45Z. They never say you can't double dip, but in fact, the law says you can't. And that really changes the calculation, because 45Q is for the benefit of those pipeline companies. 45Z is for the benefit of the ethanol. And as Larry was talking about, I remember the time that my dad and I drove to the Cedar County informational meeting, IUB meeting, the night that Wolf was holding their meeting. We got there a little early because we like to be early. We knew we were ready with our questions, you know, and we pulled up to the Cedar County Fairgrounds there, and we nearly dropped our teeth because, first of all, we were quite early, and the place was full. All the license plates. Colorado, Wyoming, Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana. We were the first Iowans there. Those are the ones making the money from these pipelines. So, yeah, in the back.
I have a couple questions.
Yep.
One, for those Iowa farmers who put their properties into a trust, what is the status of them being able to have their land stolen?
That is a great question, because we're trying to find every which way around this, right? And a lot of people, a lot of my neighbors have their land in a trust. This is a very common thing to do, right? Unless your trust specifies that your property cannot be used for a pipeline, then you are still under the threat of eminent domain. The trust in and of itself won't protect you. However, if your trust has language in it that says this is agricultural land that can never be used for a pipeline, we believe you are protected. But nobody put this in our trust. I mean, nobody put it in our trust. We weren't thinking they were going to come get us, but it might be a good thing to do.
Question number two. Hopefully this will fail, despite the big special interest money behind it, and God knows how many other things in this country. For those who have signed there's easements, is that signed signature good for anything or any future project for which somebody wants to do something nefarious like this?
That's a concern, and I'm glad you raised it. So apparently there's some kind of gray area about this, that if they already signed it, are those easements still good? There's some question about them still being under the thumb of those companies, and the court will probably decide that. But if you signed an easement, you have no protection.
And final question, is there another kind of substance created from this carbon capture pipeline that is another kind of gold mine for these companies, methanol or something like that? I've been hearing whispers that there is that possibility.
Right.
Is there something?
Well, my understanding of methanol is that you don't have to transport it via pipeline. Why? Because it can be manufactured on site. The thing about the pipeline in Iowa is that apparently we don't have the same geology as Illinois and North Dakota. Well, the reality is we don't have oil, right? So they're not going to sequester it in Iowa. That's why the pipelines are here. Right? They've been dealing with carbon dioxide for decades, right, at the ethanol plants. Now the pipelines, it's to ship it to Illinois, ship it to North Dakota, where they can sequester it, where we don't have that geology. Now methanol is a substance that it doesn't require sequestration, so you don't have to ship it to Illinois, you don't have to ship it to North Dakota. My understanding is that you can actually create something like this on site in Iowa, so you wouldn't need a pipeline, in which case you wouldn't need eminent domain. Now, whether it's good or bad, or you like the idea, you don't like the idea, that's another, kettle of fish. But the point is, they wouldn't need eminent domain.
Okay, I got a question. Cargill
Yeah.
grain is not part of this any way, shape, or form. Why did they choose not to?
Well, you'd have to ask them. I can't tell you, but what I can tell you is this. Maybe they too, like ADM, read the Inflation Reduction Act. Maybe they too know that there's other options here that could be more profitable for them.
And my second question is carbon credits as far as farmers. I understand they're going to have to be reporting what they use carbon-wise. Is that true?
I can't tell you that I know that in detail, but what I will tell you is that on the flip side of this, there's a report by Poet on their sustainability report, and Poet is saying that they would like to pay farmers for the practices that farmers are using because it will lower the carbon footprint of Poet's corn. Practices like cover cropping, no-till, prairie strips, things that a farmer could voluntarily choose to do if his land is, or her land, is right for those kinds of practices, and then the farmer would be reimbursed, presumably by a higher price for the corn commodity than not using those practices. So I think that there is an opportunity for the larger ethanol companies to be paying farmers to help farmers be able to navigate the system. As far as the inputs and tracking the inputs, I don't know, but that is an absolutely important question to find out. Yeah.
Any other questions? I got one here.
Who against Ford?
Hmm?
Who against Ford?
Poet, that's actually the world's largest ethanol corporation. So, yeah, they're, okay, yeah, and there's a bunch out in western Iowa, right, and, yeah, Nebraska, and, yeah. Poet. Yeah.
Now, when a plant uses carbon dioxide, right?
Yep,
But-
the corn plant, you mean,
Yes,
yeah,
when it's alive.
yep.
But when it dies, it also
Mhm. Releases,
releases the carbon dioxide.
yep.
So does it use more than it releases?
It's considered carbon neutral by scientists all over the world. So whether it's a corn plant, or it's a blade of grass, or it's a tree, they're all considered carbon neutral.
Or if it's a cover crop?
Right, or if it's a cover crop, yep. But as I said, you know, and that's the interesting part, is that when you drill down on the details, you see that this whole talk about, oh, we're going to capture carbon, we're going to capture carbon, we're going to capture carbon, they're only capturing the biogenic carbon dioxide, right? They're only capturing the stuff that is carbon neutral, that is coming from nature. So, yeah.
Anybody else? Mr. Schrader? You're a farmer, right? No, you're not in line of it, but could be.
Thank you. I went to a seminar, I'm thinking for, I was in a seminar with loan officers, and they had a guy talk about this carbon. And the final push that got it through was Moocham, that guy out there that's a halfway, says he's a good guy, but he's not. And the big guy up, the big wheel up in the Senate from New York. They got together some night and drank a bottle of wine. That's how it got through.
Yeah.
He convinced Moocham. Then they had these companies all signed up.
Mm-hmm.
The only one they didn't have signed up was Walmart. That was the last one. They went to Walmart with the program. Now, I don't know if Walmart is worried about the environment or how much stuff they're going to sell at the stores. But Walmart then signed on. And you know what kind of pressure Walmart can put on all the people they deal with.
Mm-hmm.
So Walmart signed on to the deal. But that's how they got that bill through. And you're exactly right on. There's so much pressure because they threw so much money at it. And probably not worth the paper it's written on.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just going to screw the American taxpayer immensely.
Yeah.
Because the farmers are ready. The things you're talking about, I'm doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's saving their soil. You know, it makes common sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all, I live up in Wisconsin, the hills. It's all no-till.
Yep.
When I take my beans off, I spread 200 pounds of urea and some AMS and put on winter wheat. It all grows up, everything's covered, and you plant right through it and then spray it. You got a cover crop and everything. You know, farmers are doing all this stuff already.
Right,
And I mean, the
exactly.
big thing is ADM and Cargill both see this. They know that this
Yep.
isn't going to work. We don't need this.
Yep.
Them boys see it.
Yep,
They know, you know. So I mean, that's where it's at.
yep.
It's just that you guys keep fighting. I don't think ADM wants to make all the farmers mad.
That's what I think too. You know what is interesting is that, well, so yeah, ADM is the big guy, you know, where I live, right? So
ADM processes more corn than anybody else in the country.
Yeah.
They control the corn price.
yeah. So the section of the Wolf pipeline, you know, Wolf is proposing to build this for ADM. And the section of the Wolf pipeline that goes through our area, so Lynn, Cedar, Scott, that's the only section of CO2 pipeline that has not asked for eminent domain. Because we've been putting so much pressure on them. I mean, we've just been relentless and organizing as neighbors and showing up and speaking. And yeah, we had a meeting in the basement of the Cedar County Board of Supervisors, and Chris Riley from ADM was there. And he's a big boy at ADM, and he sat there. He brought Wolf with him, but it's really not clear to us, you know, what the relationship is there, because it seems to us that ADM is calling the shots and that Wolf is obeying ADM's orders. Because the section of the Wolf pipeline that goes through Illinois, they did request eminent domain, but they didn't request it against us, who have been so vocal, who have really been saying, look, you can't do this to us, you know? I mean, so it has made a difference by people just talking, by people standing together, by people showing up at the Board of Supervisors meetings, by showing up, you know, at the IUB meetings. It's made a difference in our little section. We still have rights. We don't have eminent domain yet.
Well, when I talk to people that run ethanol plants and stuff like that, they're saying a lot of pressure comes out of California. A lot of pressure. If you want to deal with us, we want this stuff underneath the ground.
Yep.
It's the green people in California that don't realize anything, but there's a tremendous amount of rich people out there that feel that way, and they're pressuring the hell out of it.
Yeah, and they really don't understand what's going on. But let me show you something, if I can, because this really, I was looking at this the other night, and it really blew my mind. So that report by Princeton that I was talking about, you know, it's like 376 pages long. This is one slide from that report, and this is the report that shows the map of the United States with all the CO2 pipeline structure. This is a pro-CO2 pipeline report. Well, on another page of this report, they show, I don't know if you can read it here, a graph of capital invested in bioconversion by 2050, largely in the Midwest and Southeast. Biomass purchases grow, displacing corn for ethanol. In this report, and this is the same report that's advocating the CO2 pipelines all across our country, in this report, in the year 2050, they show 0 corn purchased for ethanol. This is what I mean, is that people are saying that the CO2 pipelines are life or death for ethanol, and they are, they're death.
The pipeline, I talked to my insurance company, and I got a gray answer. Well, we don't know who's going to be liable, whether it's you because you own the farm, or is the pipeline liable because they own the pipe, but the pipe is in ground that I own. The liability issue, it's kind of a gray area. No insurance company is given a straight answer. The answer I got from my insurance people, I'll call it gray. You don't know until after the event happens, and then everybody will be pointing fingers. You know, so that's something else to think about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who's liable?
Thanks, Jessica. Let's have a round of applause for her. Hopefully you can go to another county and do the same thing.
Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, thank you.